Well, hiya. Thank you so much for tuning into FunAhead TV. Today, we're working on the Land Cruiser again. Stay tuned. Alrighty, so like I said, we are working on the Land Cruiser again today. This is my beloved 2007 Lexus LX470. It's a Land Cruiser. It's the 100 series Land Cruiser. Everyone always gives me a bunch of crap for the fact that it's the Lexus, but hey, it's the nicer one, all right? So get off my back. I bought this car 6 months ago now, which is nuts that I've owned this car for 6 months already. And it has 250,000 miles on the clock currently. So I've just been doing things little by little to kind of mechanically refresh it. It was very well taken care of in its lifetime, but of course, anything with 250,000 miles is gonna need something, right? So basically what I've done so far is I've gone through and done all the fluids in it. I did a radiator in it. I've done a couple little things. But for the most part, this thing is cherry and good to go. But I have noticed since owning the car that there is a noise coming from the right front wheel bearing, or the right front hub. There's actually two wheel bearings. But there's a noise when you get over 75 miles an hour. Kind of strange. I think that probably means that the wheel bearing is going out. But we're going to check on that today to see whether or not it actually needs new wheel bearings in that hub, or if we can potentially just repack them, or because these are truck style hubs where they have spindle nuts and the bearings have to be under torque preload from those spindle nuts, it's possible that these things just aren't torqued down enough. So, or maybe it's a combination of the two. Anyway, we're gonna take the wheel off, we're gonna look into it and see what we find. Alrighty, here we are at the right front corner of the car. For starters, we need to go ahead and take the wheel off. So, take a 22mm socket and a stout impact and pop these puppies off. Psych, hold on a sec, I forgot about these wheel covers. Alright, now we can take the wheel off. Now next up, we're going to go ahead and take this caliper off. Normally you don't have to take the caliper all the way off to be able to access the inside here, but I'm just going to go ahead and take this off because I want to be able to take the entire rotor off. Already, I don't know if you eagle-eyed viewers can see, but I'm able to see on the bottom here, there is some dirt buildup, which is most likely caused by a faulty grease seal on the inside of this hub, which means that the wheel bearing grease has been escaping out, and that's what's causing this buildup right here. So that could be an indication of the fact that there's not as much wheel bearing grease as there should be on the inside of this hub, which could be the source of my noise and potentially failing wheel bearings. All right, I just went ahead and set the caliper on the back. Make sure when you do this, you don't put any tension on the soft line here. There is no tension in this situation because I have it setting on kind of the front side of this, this control arm here. So just make sure that you have it nice and easy so that there's nothing putting any stress on that rubber. All right, next we're gonna take off this little dust cap. There, dust cap off. All right, next up we've got a couple of things we need to address. We need to get, in order to get access to the inside of this, we need to take this hub off. So we need to do two things to do that. We need to take off these 6 14mm nuts, and then we'll take off the cone washers that are below that. I'll show you guys the process for how to do that in a second. And then there's also the circlip on the very outside here that we need to take off. So in any order, we can do that. Okay, circlip is off. Next up, it's time for us to take a 14mm socket and zap off these nuts that are holding the hub in place. So these studs have two different washer types on them. One is just a normal kind of washer, and then the other is a cone washer that is set into the hub itself to help these studs be centered into the hub. I'm going to go ahead and take off these traditional washers just so we're down to the cone type. Now it's time to attempt to get the cone washers out. So what we have to do is hit these studs to be able to back out these cone washers. There, you see how it just popped out? Yep, so that one is loose. And as you can see, I'm using this nut to kind of soften the blow on the stud itself. I don't want to damage the stud, so I'm kind of threading this down to where it's flush with the nut, or to the stud, and then using that to kind of hit on to give me more surface area. There, you see how that popped out? That's 2 down. All right, well, I'm gonna go around and just finish this with the rest of these, and now we can pull this off. Alrighty, now one kind of cool thing about the architecture of this hub is that this, because this is splined, as you can see, this is actually what the CV shaft is splined into. There is nothing else that it's splined into. It's completely loose right now. Actually, look, we can just turn. We're not turning the differential right now. We're just turning the rotor. That's why these studs are so beefy, because this hub is literally what drives this wheel. Okay, now next up we have a series of spindle nuts. So this outer one is basically the locking spindle nut, and then there is a kind of a, it's like a washer sort of, but a washer with tabs that's in between the main nut and the locking nut, and that's meant to be able to fold down the tabs so that it can then help hold the nuts in the correct orientation to one another once they're torqued down. Okay, so I may have just found our issue. I can take this spindle nut socket and turn this. I am turning it by hand, and I believe this lock nut is supposed to be torqued to 60 something foot-pounds. I'll flash up the actual torque number here in a second, but it's not supposed to be just finger tight. All right, that's problem number 1. Let's go ahead and take this off and see what we're working with here. By the way, these nuts are 54 millimeters. You need a 54 millimeter flange nut socket. This is a 55 millimeter. When you're in this kind of size range, it's 1 millimeter bigger, but it still works. And it's actually, this 55 millimeter one is much easier to find. Oh, and the reason that it's kind of nuts that the outer one was so loose is because the inner one only gets torqued to like 6 Newton meters or something very low, because you don't want to be putting a whole heck of a lot of compression pressure on those wheel bearings. So you just need enough to kind of hold them together, and then you have the lock washer that's there to like super hold that in place. And in this case, we've got nothing really holding it in place. That may have potentially caused some premature wheel bearing wear, as in it probably for sure did, but we'll find out once we get in there. I put like 2,500 miles on this car in this current condition, so. Okay, now we need to get this inner guy out, which does have a correct orientation. It has a, I'll show you. Here's our wheel bearing. It has a little tooth that slots into, I don't know if you can see it well, that little notch on the spindle. All right, from here we can take our entire assembly off, and we'll just go set it back on a bench and get a closer look at it. Okay, now here is our rotor hub assembly back on my workbench. So this is the outer wheel bearing. You can see what it looks like. It's pretty dirty, so I'm very glad that we're doing this. The grease honestly looks like it's broken down quite a bit, so I think it's very good that we're doing this. You know, this is like kind of old looking oily grease. Also, when you look inside here, I don't know if you'll be able to see very well, there should be so much more grease than that, and it's just not. It's just kind of this like oily, it's just old and broken down. I'd say it's pretty good that we're doing this service. This is going to be pretty satisfying. So when I reach in there, there is grease. I mean, as you can see, but I think the issue is there's still not enough grease, for one, and two, it's just very old, kind of rusty grease. Okay, well, obviously we can't see much right at this second, so I'm just going to go ahead and get all this stuff apart and start getting to cleaning the best I can. Alright everybody, let me show you where we are currently at with all of the right front wheel hub hardware. So, boom, look at this. This is the same stuff that I just took out of the truck. Upon some further analysis, realized that these bearings are perfectly fine. I think the main issue with them was that the grease that was still inside of that hub was basically like tar. It had completely lost all of its original lubrication properties, and literally felt like it was like thick pitch, like you could like mold it into like something like clay. It was very weird. So I think that would have certainly led to these bearings' eventual demise, but they're still here, they still turn great, and also the fact that they weren't torqued down properly within the hub probably caused a decent bit of the noise that I was hearing. Believe it or not, what I'm actually going to do is, you know, now that I've cleaned these up, I'm just going to repack them and put them back in the hub. Considering that that rotor and hub have plenty of life left in them, I'm just going to run these until I need to replace the rotor, and then I'll replace the wheel bearing and seal hardware at that time. On the note of the hub, let's go check that out real quick. All right, so here's the hub, and as you can see, I have totally cleaned the inside of this as well. You can see inside of there, we got all the old grease out. Well, for the most part, there might be like a little bit of residual, but that's all cleaned out and ready to go. So look at these races. You know, of course you can replace these races, but they're not scored up. They are not, you know, looking bad in any way. That's the inner one. And here's the outer one. It looks great still. So I think once we get all of this back together, re-greased and re-torqued, all of this is going to run very well together for many, many miles to come. And on the note of cleaning things, here we are at the truck looking at the spindle. I cleaned up all of the old grease off of the spindle, and I also cleaned up the dust shield for the rotor. As you can see, very satisfyingly, all of that old grease is gone. And actually, so on the note of reusing that seal, I had mentioned that, you know, a lot of that dirt was likely due to some of the grease escaping out of the hub. I think that is true, but as that grease breaks down, the oil kind of separates out of it, which kind of leaves behind that just kind of tar only kind of material. And so I think that's actually what was getting past the seal. I think if we put fresh grease in there, we won't get that happening through the seal. And I was able to take the seal out of that hub pretty well, to the point where there was no damage to that. So here's a closer look at the seal. You can see like the sealing surface, or the mating surface with the hub, is still very good. No damage to it. And also the seal itself is also in perfectly good shape. So I don't think we're going to get actually any of the grease coming by it. Of course, as that grease ages, you know, we might get some oil separation that maybe comes out of it. But again, for now, I'm not worried about it, and it will probably last more than long enough as is until we need to get a new rotor anyway. So we're going to go ahead and pack these bearings. I'll show you guys how to do that, and then we can put all of this back together. Alrighty, now I have my brand new grease. As you can see here, this is just high temp wheel bearing and disc brake grease. You want to get some gloves, and I'm out of my good disposable workshop gloves, and I'm using some very small kitchen gloves, and my wife is going to be mad at me for this, but actually I don't even know if I'll be able to get into these. Anyway, what you want to do is you want to I cannot talk seriously. What you want to do is load up a big glob of grease on the palm of your hand. This is actually my palm, unlike what it looks like here. You want to take the bearing and just little by little load the grease into the bearing until you can see it coming out the other end. So I'm going to put you guys on a time lapse and do that, because it does take a little while for that to fully happen. I know my hand looks freaking ridiculous, but please feel free to laugh at me. Now time to get the inner portion of the hub set in place. We need to pack the inner portion of the hub with grease. And it's easier to do on this side actually, because this side, obviously given that that's a larger bearing than the outer one, this side is much more open. So there's kind of like a trough in the center of this. Hopefully you can kind of see that a little bit. And that actually just needs to be packed flush with the rest of the inner portion of the hub. So while I still have my glove on here, you know, and we can pack a little bit more on the other side as we go, of course. But I'm just going to go ahead and put some grease in there.
Woo!
If you haven't figured it out, the name of this game is excessive grease. You can basically not have too much grease. Alright, now we've got that channel packed pretty well. So we can take our bearing here and set her home. Boom. Welcome home again, bearing. Now becomes the difficult part. Because I only have one freaking glove. Sorry, I'm like doing things without talking. We need to drive this seal home, and it needs to be flush with the outside.
Oh la la! What? Wow!
Boom! So that's pretty good. Now that we're on the the other side. As you can see, this hole is much smaller, so that's why I opted to pack the grease in from the other side. But I'm still going to pack a little bit more grease in here just for this inner race of the outer bearing.
What's that?
What we're going to do is we'll move over to the car, we'll set this on, and then we'll set the bearing over and in place, and then we will talk about the torquing procedure for how to get this all tightened up and good to go. Alrighty, well, here we have the rotor hub assembly, and I don't have the outer bearing on it quite yet. So what we're gonna do right now is just set it in place. But it's a lot easier, at least in my opinion, to just have this set on without the outer bearing in place, because nothing's holding it in, and you could potentially push it out with the outside of the CV shaft and drop it on the floor, and you don't want to do that with a freshly greased bearing. So it is time to put our outer bearing in place. There we go. Next up is this inner kind of thrust washer. We need to set that in place. There's a little slot on the spindle, and that just slots into place. And then we will thread on our innermost nut. So we now need to put this down, torque down to like a preliminary level of 59 Newton meters, which is basically just going to set all of this in place. Okay, so now that we are there and we have torqued this down to 59 Newton meters, which again is just going to kind of compress everything and set it all in place. We need to make sure that it spins nicely. And of course, it's going to have more resistance than what it normally would at 59 Newton meters. But we're just wanting to make sure that it still spins and that the bearings aren't, pissed. So that's good. Now we need to back this back off to just finger tight again. All right, then we need to put it down to 6 Newton meters, and that's going to be our final torque. There. Okay, next up we need to put back in place our little tab guy, which also has a little tooth that slots into the slot on the spindle. And then we need to thread in place our outer nut, our lock nut. So we will get this guy nice and snug. And then the outer lock nut gets torqued to 64 Newton meters, I believe. So we're going to go ahead and do that. And in the meantime, I just want to make sure that my inner nut is not turning as we do this. So kind of keep an eye on it if you can. Okay. So we now just need to pull down the tabs on our tab washer thing and lock each of the 2 nuts into place. With that good to go, I'm just going to clean up this mating surface for the outer hub so that it's not squeezing out and could potentially get on the brake rotor surface. Okay, now this has 2 little alignment dowels on either side of this hub. Cone washers set in place here.
Oh la la! What? Wow! Oh! Wow!
Let me get these turned in.
No!
Alrighty. Next up, we're going to put back our circlip on the very outside. Definitely make sure you don't forget this. A, because I just did, and B, because that's actually what holds the CV shaft in place. Good to go there. And lastly, we just got to put our dust cap back on. Okay, hub is all back together, which is nice. I'm just going to put the caliper back on. I think you guys know how to do that. It's pretty self-explanatory. So I'm going to put that back on. We'll put the wheel back on, and we'll take this thing for a test drive. Oh, hey, everybody. Well, good news. Here we are, driving the Land Cruiser, currently going about 75 miles an hour, which is exactly where I would have heard the bearing noise before. And fortunately, it is whisper quiet. So we know we solved our issue. That's a very nice thing. Now all I need to do is go do the same thing to the left front and completely repack it and get it all cherry as well. So I think we can pat ourselves on the back and say job well done today. Thank you guys so much for watching and tuning into FunAhead TV, and I will see you guys next time.